have you ever noticed how every few months someone asks the same question? Why do people keep romanticizing villains? Or they phrase it differently. Why does everyone want the bad guy to win? What happened to heroes? Why does no one want to be with a hero? It's one of those debates that never seem to disappear, and honestly, I think we are asking the wrong question here. Because after years of reading fantasy and writing it myself, I don't think people are fascinated by villains because they're evil or not. I think we are fascinated by villains because they're the characters who change the story. Think about your favorite fantasy novel for a moment. Now imagine removing the villain from it. What happens? Likely almost nothing. The kingdom doesn't fall, the ancient evil never wakes up, the revolution never begins. The prophecy remains just an old piece of parchment gathering dust in a forgotten archive. Heroes often react. There's a reason why reluctant hero is a popular archetype, but reluctant villain? Not so much. Villains usually act. They're the people who force the world to move, and stories by their very nature are about change. That's the first reason we remember them so vividly. Not because they're good people or bad people, but because they matter. The second reason I think is even more interesting. The best villains rarely think they're villains. Nobody wakes up in the morning and reflects on the new massacre. How can I become the most despicable person imaginable? How can I kill all those innocents? Unless that's the whole point and it's played for laughs. I mean, we all love James Bond villains, but they are not the ones we fall in love with. The greatest fantasy antagonists usually believe they're right. Some want peace, others seek justice. Some crave revenge, and some of them genuinely believe they're saving the world. And that's exactly what makes them compelling. Because suddenly you're not just watching a battle between good and evil, you're watching two different visions of the world collide. The villain isn't merely trying to defeat the hero, they're trying to convince them. Sometimes they're even trying to convince you. And sometimes it works, let's face it. What if order really is more important than freedom? What if compassion sometimes causes more suffering than cruelty? What if history only changes because someone was willing to become a monster for it to change? You don't have to agree with those ideas. But once the story asks them honestly, it's very difficult to stop thinking about them. In fact, sometimes you never stop thinking. There's another thing I've noticed. People often assume that readers love villains because they're attracted to darkness. Some of us are, but most people are not, and most readers and writers are not fascinated by darker characters as partners or friends. They're attracted to competence most of the time. Fantasy readers have always loved extraordinary, capable characters. Think about it. Nobody ever falls for the foolish, cruel goblin serving the darkness. Think Viewmaster Todd from the Dragonlance series, for example. He doesn't have many fans. But Raistlin Majiri and Danamar Argent from the same series, these guys can open a dating club because they're competent. The same goes for legendary generals, brilliant scholars, and impossible mages, master manipulators, and all those beautiful and traumatized people with shadow powers. Characters who walk into a room and somehow seem to understand everything before everyone else does. Competence is fascinating, even when it's frightening, especially when it's frightening. Nobody falls in love with Shadmem's Mora from the Elder Scrolls because of his impressive physique. Let's face it, we are not there for the cheekbones, and tentacles were never the point. We admire characters who seem to understand something hidden from everyone else. Knowledge has always been seductive, power has always been seductive. Not because we necessarily want to possess it ourselves. Well, sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. But because stories allow us to explore what it might feel like. Ironically, though, my favorite villains aren't the ones who always win. They're the ones who fail repeatedly, sometimes spectacularly. The villain who never loses eventually becomes boring. Perfection kills tension, and failure creates character. Some lose kingdoms, some lose families, others lose the very ideals they once believed in. And yet some achieve everything they ever wanted only to discover that it was never enough. And we can relate to that, or we can understand it at least. Those are the villains we remember, those are the villains I remember. Because failure changes people. Heroes aren't the only characters allowed to grow, and sometimes the most heartbreaking and interesting character arc belongs to the antagonist. Sometimes what some readers call toxic is what spurs others, because we do want gasoline to set it on fire. This is why I think people misunderstand what it means to enjoy a villain. Loving fictional villains isn't the same thing as approving of them or endorsing them. We don't read tragedies because we secretly want tragedies to happen. We don't enjoy Shakespeare because we'd like to spend an evening dethroning Scottish kings. Stories are one of the safest places we have to explore dangerous ideas. That's one of literature's greatest gift. It lets us stand beside people we never want to become, or people we would want to become but cannot. It lets us understand them, sometimes sympathize with them, and sometimes scorn them, and then quietly close the book and return to our own lives. Probably a little wiser, probably a bit more excited, which brings me to the reason I keep writing villains and reading about them. People assume writers create compelling villains because they secretly admire them. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes they are just cooler than heroes, I'll admit. They also usually have better fashion sense. Fantasy has built unfairly generous to villains in that department, let's face it. But that's not why I and others keep returning to them. I don't read about villains or write them because I want readers to admire them. I want to challenge them because villains expose ambition, fear, loyalty, obsession, hope. Without temptation, courage means very little. Without impossible choices, morality is easy. Without someone willing to reshape the world, heroes rarely discover who they really are. And that's where stories become unforgettable, because you can debate who the villain really is, or if he is the villain. Maybe that's why fantasy keeps returning to villains. Not because everyone wants them to win. Sometimes we do, and that's a brilliant debate why and how. But oftentimes it's because they reveal the deepest truth about everyone else, and they're honest in that. And I hope fantasy never stops writing them. In truth, villains are one of the most fascinating parts we can explore as readers and writers. Yes, it's fine to sometimes want the villain to win or fall in love with a villain, because it's about challenging ideas and reliving scenarios that you may not want to relive in your life, or may want but would never even confess that to yourself. And that's why I think villains are fascinating. I'm Teodora. I write and think about dark fantasy, history, and obsession.